The Texas hill country goes dark fast after sundown. One minute the sky burns amber and wide. The next, stars come out, and the land beneath them falls quiet in a way city people never quite get used to. On this particular night, the darkness had not yet reached the Hargrove Ranch. Lanterns burned across the back terrace. 90 guests in pressed collars. Bourbon, low laughter, and the warm hum of a celebration 40 years in the making. At the head of a long oak table, an old man with a gray beard and rough hands stood holding a silver letter opener above a green silk box. Then a child's voice cut through everything. Small, clear, certain, nobody moved, nobody believed her. And in the next 4 minutes, the man opened the box anyway. What happened after that nobody in that room saw coming.
"Don't open that box, sir. Please don't touch it." The words cut through the chandelier light like a blade through silk. There are men who inherit their lives, and there are men who carve them out of stone with their bare hands. Walter Hargrove had always been the second kind. He was born in a 2-room house outside Odessa, Texas, in a year when the wind carried more dust than rain, and he learned early that nothing in this world arrives free. By 14, he was working roughnecking shifts on other men's rigs, hauling pipe in the brutal flat heat, listening to older men talk about fortunes that always seemed to belong to somebody else. By 26, he had scraped together enough trust and enough sheer stubbornness to convince a small regional bank to lend him money no one else wanted to lend a kid with rough hands and a borrowed truck. He bought one broken-down rig. He fixed it himself working nights by lantern light when the bank wouldn't extend credit for a mechanic. He drilled it dry twice before it finally paid. That single rig became two. Two became a fleet. A fleet became Hargrove Industries, one of the largest privately held energy and construction firms in the state. 4 decades built one impossible decision at a time. Through every one of those decisions, there had been one person standing beside him who was not family by blood, but had become something close enough to it that the difference rarely seemed to matter. Vivian Cross had walked into his life at a regional trade dinner 35 years earlier, sharp-eyed and 12 years younger than him, with a law degree and an instinct for negotiation that Walter had never seen matched, not before her and not since. She had structured the deal that took the company statewide. She had sat beside him in the hospital waiting room the night his wife passed, holding his hand without a single word, because she understood that some grief does not want comforting, only company. For 35 years, Walter Hargrove had trusted Vivian Cross with nearly everything he owned. Tonight, he had planned to trust her with the rest of it. The ranch sat 50 miles outside the city, far enough that the noise of the world fell away once you crossed the cattle guard at the front gate, far enough that a man could stand on his own porch at night and hear nothing but wind and the distant complaint of a coyote somewhere out past the tree line. Walter had bought the land 20 years earlier when the company first turned a profit large enough to let him buy something purely because he loved it rather than because it would generate revenue. And he had built the main house himself, board by board, the same way he had built everything else in his life. Guests who came out from the city for the first time always remarked on how quiet it was, how the stars seemed closer here than anywhere else in Texas. And Walter always told them the same thing in response. The quiet was the whole point. A man spent enough of his life inside the noise of boardrooms and earnings calls. He had built this place to remember what silence sounded like. Tonight, that silence had been filled with string lights and laughter, with 90 guests gathered beneath lanterns strung across the back terrace, with the particular electric hum of a celebration that mattered, the kind a man only gets a handful of in one lifetime. Walter Hargrove stood at the head of a long oak table beneath a string of warm lanterns out on the back terrace of his Texas ranch, where the hill country rolled gold and green behind him in the last hour of sunlight. A silver letter opener rested in his right hand. A velvet ribbon hung loose between 2 thick fingers, fingers that had once turned wrenches on broken-down oil rigs before they ever signed a contract worth $1 million. He was 71 years old that evening. His beard was gray and full-trimmed, close along the jaw, the way it had been for 30 years, the kind of beard that made men trust him before he ever said a word. His hands were rough, his eyes were sharp, and on the table in front of him sat a tall white gift box wrapped in deep green silk, the centerpiece of his birthday and something more than his birthday. Tonight was the night Walter Hargrove planned to hand over the chairmanship of Hargrove Industries. 40 years he had built that company. 40 years from a single drilling rig he financed with a loan no bank wanted to give a 26-year-old with calloused hands and a stubborn jaw. 40 years until it became one of the largest privately held energy and construction firms in the state of Texas. Tonight, in front of 90 guests, family, lifelong friends, board members, he was going to say the words out loud. The company would have a new chairman. His legacy would be official. A folder already sat waiting in his study, the papers drawn up by the company's outside counsel, the transition timeline mapped to the week. His nephew Cole had spent 6 years earning that folder, learning the business from the rig floor, up the way Walter had always insisted any Hargrove must blood or otherwise. Walter had rehearsed the words he would say tonight a dozen times in front of the bathroom mirror, feeling each time the strange mixture of pride and grief that comes from handing your life's work to someone else's hands, even hands you trust completely. But first there was a gift. It was the box his closest business partner had personally placed there an hour before, insisting Walter open it in front of everyone the way she always insisted on things, with a smile so practiced it looked like sunlight. For one long second, Walter did not move. Across the terrace near the stone archway that led toward the kitchen, Carol Brennan, the head of household staff, froze with a tray still balanced in both hands. "Ruby," Carol said, her voice low, frightened, already apologizing before she even reached the front of the gathering. "Baby, come here. Right now. Come to me, please." But Ruby did not move. "She put something inside it," Ruby said. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. "I saw her do it." Across the terrace, Vivian Cross rose slowly from the chair beside Walter. She wore a deep emerald dress, the kind that caught the lantern light, and held it with a string of pearls at her throat that had belonged to her mother. Until that moment, she had looked like a woman thoroughly enjoying her oldest friend's milestone night. The partner who had stood beside Walter at every rig opening, every shareholder meeting, every funeral. The woman the whole company called, half in admiration, half in something closer to fear, the right hand of Hargrove Industries. Now her smile tightened at the edges. Just slightly, the way silk pulls when it begins to tear. "Excuse me," Vivian said. Ruby pointed at the green silk box. "You went into the gift room. You took something out of your bag. You put it inside that box before you tied the ribbon back." I was behind the plant," Ruby said. "I saw the whole thing." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. This was supposed to be a quiet, elegant evening. 90 guests, all of them chosen with care. Family, old friends, the men and women who had stood beside Walter Hargrove since the company was nothing but a dream and a rusted derrick. No press, no outsiders, just trust and 40 years of work finally being handed to the next generation. Vivian pressed one hand flat against her chest, as if the accusation itself had struck her there. "That is a terrible thing to say," she said, her voice still soft but no longer warm. "Ruby, sweetheart, I don't know what you think you saw, but you cannot run into a private celebration in front of all these people and accuse me of trying to hurt Walter." Carol reached her daughter and placed both hands on her small shoulders. "Mr. Hargrove, Miss Cross, I am so sorry," Carol said, her voice trembling now. She must have misunderstood something. She was supposed to be inside watching a movie. "I didn't misunderstand," Ruby said. Her chin lifted. "I saw her. I saw the whole thing." Vivian let out a short, disbelieving laugh and turned it toward the crowd like she was sharing a private joke with all of them. "She saw the whole thing," Vivian repeated, looking around the table. "A 9-year-old girl hiding behind a potted plant knows more than the grown men and women who built this company." "I wasn't hiding to be bad," Ruby said. "I was just looking at the presents because they were pretty. Then I saw you come in. You looked at the door first. Then you took the lid off Mr. Hargrove's box. Then you put something inside it and tied it back." Somewhere near the middle of the table, a man leaned toward his wife and muttered something about attention-seeking children. An older woman in pearls shook her head sadly, the way people do when they have already decided who is lying. "Children get strange ideas at parties like this," the woman in pearls whispered to the guest beside her. "Her mother works for the family. She probably just wants to feel important tonight." "Maybe she saw something on television," another voice offered. "Children copy what they see." "She's making up a story," someone else murmured, not quite low enough. Carol heard every word of it. She had spent 11 years inside this house, learning the particular silence required of someone who works for people far wealthier than herself, the silence that says nothing and absorbs everything. She had come to Texas from a small town in the Panhandle, a single mother with a toddler and a resume full of jobs that had never quite added up to security, and the position at the Hargrove Ranch had felt at the time like the first piece of solid ground she had stood on in years. Walter had never once made her feel small for needing the work, which was more than she could say for some of the families she had cleaned house for before him. In over a decade, she had allowed herself slowly and carefully to believe that this particular kind of safety might actually last. She had learned to disappear into doorways to refill glasses without being thanked, to let insults pass over her like weather. She had never once imagined that silence would be tested through her own daughter. Standing in the middle of a crowd of strangers being called a liar, her shoulders stiffened, but she kept her eyes down. Ruby heard it too. Her small face hardened with the stubborn dignity of a child who knew she was being doubted, but had not yet learned how to surrender to it. She did not look at the woman in pearls. She did not look at the man who had muttered about attention. She kept her eyes on the green silk box the way a person keeps their eyes on a fire they know is still burning even after everyone around them insists it has gone out. "I don't want attention," she said. "I'm telling the truth." Walter set the letter opener down slowly against the white tablecloth. "Ruby," he said carefully, "look at me." She did. "Are you sure you didn't see one of the staff arranging the gift, adjusting the bow maybe, for the photographs?" "No, sir." "It came from Ms. Cross's purse," Ruby said. "The little black one with the gold flower on it. She has it on her chair right now." Every eye at the table turned toward the chair beside Walter. The small black clutch sat there exactly as Ruby had described it. A thin gold flower clasp catching the last orange light of the sunset. Vivian followed his gaze to the chair, then looked back at him with a calm, almost amused expression, the kind of expression she had used to talk her way past 100 boardroom objections over the years. "Yes, Walter, that's my clutch. I've had it with me all evening the same way every woman at this table has had her purse with her. Are we searching purses now based on the imagination of a child?" A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the nearest guests, the kind people give when they want a moment to be over. Ruby did not laugh. Carol did not laugh. And near the back of the terrace by the service doorway, Carol could feel the eyes of the older waitstaff on her, the particular kind of sympathy reserved for a mother whose child had just humiliated her in front of the wrong people. Walter looked down the length of his table. 89 other gifts sat stacked along the side wall on long display tables. Cards, bottles of bourbon older than some of the guests, custom belt buckles, framed photographs of the rig that had started it all, a vintage hunting rifle still in its case, a gift from a man who had known Walter since they were both 20 years old and broke. Nothing about any of them seemed unusual, and not one other person in the entire gathering looked afraid. "Ruby," Walter said more gently now, "everyone else's gifts look fine. Nothing's wrong with the table. Are you certain it was that box?" "Yes, sir. The big green one with the white satin inside the bow. Ms. Carroll said it was your special one because Ms. Cross brought it herself and made everyone put it in the middle." Near the service doorway, Carol went very still. Ruby was right. Vivian had insisted on placing the green silk box in the centerpiece position. She had even adjusted the angle twice so the ribbon faced directly toward Walter's chair. An older guest near the head of the table, a longtime board member's wife, who had known Walter since the company's earliest years, leaned toward the woman beside her and murmured something that did not carry far, but carried far enough. "Vivian was out here arranging that box a full hour before anyone else arrived tonight," she whispered. "I remember thinking it was strange how particular she was about where it sat." No one acted on the comment. It drifted past the moment like smoke noticed by only a handful of guests gone, almost as soon as it was said. But Margaret, seated at the far end of the table, heard every word of it and filed it away the way she filed away most things that seemed small until they suddenly weren't. Vivian saw the look on Carol's face and spoke quickly. "Yes, I positioned it because I wanted Walter to see it first. That is what a friend does when she has spent 6 months finding the right gift for a man who built an empire from nothing and refuses to buy himself anything nice. She makes sure he opens it first." "Is that a crime now?" She turned back to Ruby. The softness in her voice disappeared. "But this, sweetheart, this is wrong. It is hurtful. I am standing here as Walter's oldest friend in front of the people who love him, and you are accusing me of trying to hurt him on the night he hands over everything he built. Do you understand what you are saying? Ruby's fingers tightened around the small stuffed rabbit she had been carrying since the kitchen hallway. I understand, she said. I'm trying to keep him safe. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Enough. Carol lowered her voice. Ruby, baby, please, come with me. We'll talk in the back. But Ruby moved first. Before Carol could stop her, before Walter understood what was happening, Ruby darted forward, grabbed the green silk box with both hands, and pulled it toward the edge of the table away from him. Gasps rose around the gathering. Ruby, Carol cried. Put that down! Vivian snapped, her voice losing its warmth entirely. Ruby held the box against her chest, both small arms wrapped around it as tightly as she could manage. He can't open this. Please, please don't let him. Walter pushed his chair back and stood. Ruby, he said, firm now. Hand me the box. No, sir. Ruby, it's a gift. It will not hurt me. He stepped toward her and reached out. Ruby turned her small body away, but he caught the edge of the box before it slipped from her arms entirely. For one tense moment, their hands rested on the same green silk lid. Ruby's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let go. Let go, Walter said, quieter now. Please let go of the box, Ruby. She hesitated. He used that single hesitation to draw the box firmly from her arms, not violently, but with the kind of decisive strength a man uses when he believes with everything in him that he is protecting a child from her own confusion. The box landed back on the table with a soft thud against the white linen. Ruby stood frozen, her arms now empty. The stuffed rabbit slipped from under her elbow and dropped to the stone floor at her feet unnoticed. Vivian pressed a hand over her mouth as though she were the one who had just been wronged. My God, she said softly. She tried to take your birthday gift right out of your hands, Walter, in front of everyone. She shook her head slowly. This is not a misunderstanding anymore. This is something serious. Margaret Hargrove, Walter's older sister, sat at the far end of the table and had not spoken a single word since the moment started. At 75, she had lived long enough to distrust both panic and performance in equal measure, and she had learned to tell the difference between the two by watching hands, not faces. Her eyes moved from Ruby's stiff little posture to Vivian's trembling fingers to the green silk box sitting at the center of the table like a held breath. Walter looked out at the gathering. He could feel the evening slipping sideways beneath him, the way a man feels the ground shift before he understands why. He could feel Vivian beside him, wounded and impatient the way she always became when she did not get her way fast enough. And more than anything, he wanted to believe that the woman who had stood next to him through 40 years of building something out of dust had not just walked into his gift room and put something dangerous inside the box, meant to mark the proudest night of his life. He thought for one brief moment of the night Vivian had sat beside him at the hospital all those years ago, saying nothing, simply staying. He thought of the contracts she had fought for him in rooms full of men who underestimated her because of her age and her gender both. He thought of 35 years and how much weight that number carried, and how a man does not throw away 35 years on the word of a 9-year-old, no matter how steady her voice sounded. It was that thought more than any other that made the decision for him. So he picked the letter opener back up. Enough, Walter said, though not unkindly. The box is fine. It's a gift from one of the closest friends I have ever had. Walter, Margaret said quietly. He looked at her. It's all right, Margaret, he said. Vivian touched his arm. You don't have to prove anything. We could set it aside. Open it tomorrow when things are calmer. I don't want you to feel pressured. But the way she said it made it sound as though she very much needed him to open it right now in front of everyone before the moment passed and the chance was gone. Walter glanced at Ruby. The child stood rigid, her small hands now clenched at her sides. She was not crying anymore. She was not begging. She was simply watching him with the kind of patience that breaks a grown man's heart, later the patience of someone who had said everything she knew how to say and could only wait now to see if any of it had mattered. For a brief moment, something passed through him, faint and unfamiliar, like the shadow of a memory he could not quite place. He thought of himself at 9 years old, standing in a dirt yard outside Odessa, trying to tell his own father that a length of pipe on the rig looked wrong, and being waved off because he was a child, because children did not know anything about drilling, because the men around him had decades of experience and he had none. He remembered the particular sting of being right 3 days later when that same pipe failed and nearly cost a man his hand. He had never forgotten how it felt to be dismissed. And yet here he stood, 71 years old, doing the very same thing to a child who had done nothing but tell him the truth. He pushed the thought away. There would be time to examine it later. There was not time now, not with 90 guests watching and Vivian's hand resting gently on the back of his chair. "Just the lid," Walter said. "Then we can stop frightening each other." He slid the letter opener beneath the satin ribbon and gave a gentle pull. The bow loosened in his hand. He set the opener down and lifted the lid with both palms, slow and careful, the way a man opens something he has decided against every quiet instinct in his chest to trust. A few seconds passed, then 10, then 20. Inside, resting on a bed of folded white tissue paper, sat a beautiful antique chess set. Hand-carved ivory pieces, a deep mahogany board polished until it caught the lantern light, a small handwritten card tucked just beside the king. A nervous laugh moved through the gathering. Someone near the back clapped and several others joined in, relieved that the strange, ugly moment had finally passed. Vivian closed her eyes and pressed one hand against the back of Walter's chair, the picture of relief. "Oh, thank God," she whispered loud enough for the guests near the head of the table to hear it clearly. "Walter, I was terrified." She turned slightly, fingertips at her lips. "I just wanted this night to be beautiful for you." She looked pale, but not the way Walter would a minute later. Hers was a public kind of relief, arranged carefully for the room to witness. Walter reached down and picked up the small card. As his fingers slipped beneath the chessboard to check for a signature underneath the way a collector does, out of habit, a sharp, hot sting shot through the pad of his thumb. He pulled his hand back fast. A bead of blood welled up against his skin. "Ouch," he said softly, almost embarrassed by the small sound he made. He looked at his thumb. A tiny puncture, no bigger than a pinprick, already pearling red. "Walter," Vivian said. "It's nothing." He pressed his thumb against a napkin. "There must be a pin somewhere in the lining. They use them sometimes to hold the velvet in place." Ruby was already moving. "Mama, get him a doctor, right now." Carol stepped forward, voice catching. "Ruby, baby. Mama, please." Margaret stood her chair, sliding back several inches against the stone. Something in her sister's instinct had been alive since the moment that box was placed at the center of the table, and it had not gone quiet yet. "Walter," she said, "let me see your hand." He held it out, half amused, half indulgent, the way a man does when his older sister fusses over a scratch. "Margaret, it's a pinprick." She looked at it carefully. Then she looked at the chess set. Then she looked at Vivian. "Did you wrap this yourself?" "Of course I did. I wouldn't trust a gift like this to a shop." "And the lining?" "It came that way, from the dealer." "Margaret, what are you implying?" Margaret did not answer. Her eyes stayed on Walter's thumb. The skin around the small wound was beginning to redden in a way that pin marks did not usually redden, and a faint heat was rising up the back of his hand. "Walter," she said, sharper now. "Sit down." "I'm fine." The first wave hit a moment later. A strange tightness moved up his forearm. His vision shimmered at the edges the way the air shimmers above hot asphalt in July. He shifted in his chair, pressing his free hand flat against the table. Heat crawled up the back of his neck. The smell of magnolia, candle wax, and bourbon pressed against him all at once, far too strong, far too close. He swallowed. His mouth had gone bone dry. "Walter," Margaret said sharply. "I'm fine," he answered automatically. But he was not. A wave of nausea rolled through him, sudden and unmistakable. He tried to push his chair back, but the motion made the whole terrace tilt sideways. His face lost its color. One hand gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white against the wood. Vivian rushed toward him with a cry loud enough to make several guests flinch. "Walter, oh my God, Walter, what's happening?" She reached for his shoulder. Margaret stepped between them so quickly that Vivian nearly stumbled backward off her own heels. "Don't touch him," Margaret said. Her voice had gone flat and cold like glass. "Margaret, he is my best friend." "Get away from my brother." A man rose quickly from a chair 3 seats down. Dr. Hugh Bennett had been Walter Hargrove's personal physician for 15 years, and he had not earned that trust by hesitating. Everyone step back. Give him air. He was already at Walter's side, 2 fingers pressed against the inside of his wrist, his other hand checking the man's pupils in the lantern light. Walter, look at me. Right here. Tell me what you feel. My hand, Walter managed, burning up the arm. What did he touch? Hugh asked sharply, looking around the table. There was a pin, Margaret said, under the lining. He pricked his thumb. Nobody touches that box, Hugh said. The command cracked through the gathering like a whip. Nobody touches that lid. Nobody touches the lining. Nobody touches the card or the pieces. The box stays exactly where it is. Vivian covered her face with both hands. This is a nightmare, she said. This was supposed to be the happiest night of his life. She was crying now, real tears, or convincing ones, the kind nobody in the family would be able to tell apart for a long time afterward. I bought him that set. I researched it for months. Oh God, what if the dealer... Vivian, Margaret said. Step away. Now. Vivian lowered her hand slowly. Margaret, I'm scared too. Step away. Vivian stepped back. Ruby stood beside her mother, now very still, watching the adults finally move with the urgency she had tried with everything in her small body to give them 10 minutes earlier. She did not look pleased. She did not look proud. She looked like a child who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long and had finally been allowed to set part of it down. Hugh was already on his phone calling for an ambulance. Walter's longtime ranch foreman pulled a truck around in case they could move faster on the back roads than any ambulance could find them. 2 of the household security men stationed near the property line for the party took up positions on either side of the head table, not letting anyone, family or guest, near the chess box. Hugh, Walter asked through gritted teeth, the nausea building into something closer to a roar in his stomach. What is this? I don't know yet. Hugh set his fingers steady on Walter's wrist, despite the chaos around them. He had treated Walter through 2 heart scares, a broken leg from a rig accident decades ago, and more late-night calls than he could count, and in 15 years he had never once seen the man's face go this particular shade of gray. But you only made contact with the pin. We caught it early. That matters. He turned to Margaret. We move him now. There's room in the foreman's truck. Pulse is elevated but stable. Whatever this is, the dose was small and it entered through a tiny wound. That's the best version of this. And the worst? Margaret asked quietly. Hugh did not answer her, which was its own answer. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had buried a husband and outlived 2 of her own siblings, and she had learned over 75 years that the silences a doctor chooses not to fill are always the ones that matter most. As 2 of the ranch hands helped lift Walter from his chair, the gathering had collapsed into a stunned, terrible silence. A board member near the wall leaned toward his wife and whispered something. His wife only nodded, pale, her hand at her throat. The lantern swayed gently overhead in the evening breeze, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. Somewhere near the back of the terrace, a string quartet that had been hired for the occasion stood frozen mid-song bows, lowered, none of them certain whether to keep playing or simply disappear into the dark beyond the patio lights. A caterer near the kitchen door dropped a tray of champagne flutes, and the sound of breaking glass seemed to ring far louder than it should have, the way small sounds do in the middle of a catastrophe. Walter was guided toward the truck. As Hugh and the ranch hands moved him through the crowd, he turned his head, searching the faces around him, until he found Ruby. Their eyes met. He said nothing. He was too sick to speak. But the look on his face had changed. It was no longer indulgent. It was no longer apologetic in the small, dismissive way it had been a minute earlier. It was something else entirely now. It was the look of a man who had just learned in the worst possible way that a child had seen what he had refused to see. The green silk box stayed behind on the table beneath the string of lanterns. The ivory chess pieces gleamed in the fading light, as though nothing at all had happened to them, as though they had not just changed the rest of Walter Hargrove's life. By the time the truck reached the county hospital 40 minutes later, the gravel of the back roads behind them, the birthday celebration had become something no amount of money could quietly cover up. The emergency entrance doors swung open under bright fluorescent light. Margaret stayed beside the gurney, one hand braced near her brother's shoulder, giving the trauma team short, clear instructions as they moved. Single puncture wound, right thumb. Contact with an unknown substance via a concealed pin inside a wrapped gift. Symptoms started within 90 seconds. Burning nausea, dizziness. He is stable. He is conscious. He is talking. She paused, glancing down at her brother's pale face. He is also stubborn, so do not let him try to stand up. Walter, lying flat now under the harsh white lights, managed to lift his head an inch. I can hear you. You can hear, Margaret said, stepping in beside the gurney before anyone else could answer him. You cannot speak. You cannot argue. You cannot stand. Those are the new rules until I say otherwise. Under any other circumstance, Walter might have smiled at that. But another wave of strange heat moved through his arm, and he closed his eyes against the brightness. Instead, the chandelier light of the terrace, already a memory from some other gentler night. Behind them, the rest of the family arrived in a tense, frightened cluster. Walter's younger nephew, a steady young man named Cole Hargrove, who had been groomed for years to take the chairmanship that very night, hurried in still wearing his evening jacket, his jaw clenched tight. Then came Carol and Ruby. Carol held her daughter's hand tightly as they crossed the hospital lobby. Ruby walked close to her mother's side, the small stuffed rabbit retrieved from the terrace floor by one of the kitchen staff tucked back under her arm. She had not wanted to come. She had said so twice on the drive over. Mama, they don't want us there. The family should be alone. But Margaret had heard her standing near the ambulance bay and had turned her face pale but her voice steady as stone. Your daughter tried to save my brother tonight. That makes you family enough to come. Carol had not known what to say after that. Now in the hospital's quiet hallway, the separation between two worlds stood painfully clear. The Hargroves were led toward a private family lounge, leather chairs, a coffee station, a nurse assigned only to them. Carol paused at the doorway, unsure if she was even allowed inside. Margaret noticed. Mrs. Brennan, she said softer now. Please come in. Carol hesitated. Ma'am, we can wait outside. No, Margaret said. You and Ruby stay where I can see you. Ruby climbed into a chair near the corner of the room, her feet not reaching the floor. She held the rabbit against her chest and stared at the closed door down the hallway, the one with her name written on a whiteboard outside it that read only Walter Hargrove, the rest left blank waiting. The lounge smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a smell that did not belong anywhere near a man who had spent his whole life under open sky. Carol sat beside her daughter, one arm around her small shoulders, watching the second hand of a clock on the wall move slower than any clock had ever moved before. Cole stood by the window, his evening jacket draped over the back of a chair, his phone in one hand, though he had not looked at it in 20 minutes. Margaret had not sat down at all. She stood near the door, arms folded, the posture of a woman who had decided that sitting down meant accepting that there was nothing left to do but wait. Down the hall behind a door none of them were allowed past. Machines beeped in a steady, indifferent rhythm, the only sound in the building that did not seem to know anything terrible had happened at all. Outside in the parking lot, the lanterns from the ranch were still glowing somewhere far behind them, hanging over a table that no one had cleared beside a green silk box that the sheriff's department would soon seal inside a plastic evidence bag. The chess pieces would sit untouched until morning ivory kings and queens, frozen mid-game on a board no one would finish. And somewhere down that quiet hospital hallway behind a closed door, a 71-year-old man who had built an empire with his own two hands lay very still under bright lights, his bandaged thumb throbbing in slow, steady rhythm like a clock counting down towards something he could not yet name. He did not know yet about the false bottom in the box. He did not know about the camera in the gift room that had captured everything. He did not know that the woman who had stood beside him for 35 years had not come to celebrate his legacy at all. He did not know that somewhere across town, in an apartment with the blinds drawn, a phone call was already being made, and a voice on the other end was asking a single question: did it work? He only knew one thing lying there in the dark behind his closed eyes, the words returning to him over and over like the tide, patient and relentless, the way truth always returns no matter how many times it gets pushed away. Don't open that box, sir. A 9-year-old girl had told him the truth, and he had taken it out of her hands. The hospital settled into a different kind of silence after midnight, the kind that has nothing to do with peace. Machines hummed steady rhythms behind closed doors. Nurses moved through the hallway in soft shoes, their voices lowered to a register reserved for places where bad news arrives, quietly, never with a shout. Margaret Hargrove stood at the window of the private family lounge, arms folded, watching her own reflection layered over the dark parking lot outside, where a single ambulance sat parked beneath a security light, its back doors still open. She thought of the last time she had stood in a hospital corridor like this one decades ago. Now, the night their father's heart finally gave out after years of warning signs everyone in the family had chosen to ignore because acknowledging them felt too much like admitting the man was mortal. She remembered thinking even then how strange it was that wealth could buy almost anything, except the one thing a family needed most in moments like these, which was simply more time. Behind her, Cole sat with his elbows on his knees staring at the floor, his tie long since discarded, the top button of his dress shirt undone. He had flown back from a site inspection in Midland only that afternoon specifically for the ceremony, specifically to hear his uncle say the words that would make 6 years of preparation official. Instead, he had spent the night watching paramedics wheel the only father figure he had left through a set of double doors, uncertain whether he would walk back out of them. Carol sat in the corner with Ruby curled against her side, the girl's eyes finally closing from exhaustion somewhere near 1 in the morning, though her small hand never let go of the stuffed rabbit. Carol had not moved from that chair in nearly 2 hours. She kept replaying the moment on the terrace, the laughter, the whispered comments, the particular hot shame of standing silent while strangers decided her daughter was a liar. And beneath the shame, something else now beginning to surface. Something closer to anger than she had allowed herself to feel toward people who employed her in 11 years of careful practice restraint. Dr. Hugh Bennett pushed through the door just after 2. Margaret turned first. "He's stable," Hugh said before anyone had to ask. The 2 words landed in the room like a held breath finally released. "His vitals have leveled off. The swelling around the puncture site hasn't spread. He's talking, he's irritated, and he's already trying to negotiate his own discharge, which tells me his spirit is in better shape than his blood chemistry." A short, exhausted laugh escaped Cole. "Can we see him?" Margaret asked. "2 at a time for now," Hugh said. Then his expression shifted, the relief in his face folding into something more careful. "There's something else. The lab ran the initial toxicology panel faster than I expected because I told them what happened wasn't an accident, and they treated it accordingly." Margaret's arms tightened across her chest. "Tell me." "The substance on that pin wasn't anything you'd find in a hardware store or a garden shed," Hugh said. "It isn't a household poison. It isn't anything pharmaceutical either, not in any form a doctor would recognize from a prescription pad. The chemist who ran the preliminary screen described it as synthetic and built for a specific purpose. Small dose, minimal entry point, designed to act fast enough to cause cardiac symptoms, but slow enough that if no doctor happened to be standing 3 feet away, it could pass for a heart event. Natural causes, no questions asked." The room went very still. "You're telling me someone built that pin to kill him and make it look like his heart simply gave out?" Margaret said. Her voice did not rise. It dropped instead, low and hard, the voice of a woman doing arithmetic she did not want to do. "I'm telling you what the lab told me," Hugh said. "And I'm telling you that if your brother had been alone in that gift room, or if I'd been out at my truck taking a phone call instead of seated 3 chairs down, we would not be having this conversation in a hospital hallway tonight." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Carol from the corner said quietly, "Ruby tried to tell us." Every head in the room turned toward her. "She tried to tell all of us," Carol said again, her voice trembling, not with fear now, but with something closer to fury, the particular fury of a mother who has watched her child be dismissed and is only now allowing herself to feel the full weight of it. "And we let an entire terrace full of grown adults decide she was lying because she's 9, and because I work for this family, and because the woman holding the bag was wearing pearls." Margaret crossed the room and crouched in front of Carol's chair, the closest thing to an apology her proud, careful face was capable of forming in that moment. "You're right," Margaret said simply, "and it will not happen again. Not in this family." Carol looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once and said nothing more. Cole sat down slowly beside Ruby's chair a few minutes later, his elbows on his knees, his voice careful, the way a man speaks to a child he does not want to frighten further. "Ruby," he said, "can I ask you something about what you saw?" Ruby looked at him still half asleep, but she nodded. You said Ms. Cross took the lid off. Did you see how she got inside it? The box looked sealed shut from the outside. It wasn't the lid first, Ruby said, rubbing one eye. She turned the whole box upside down. The bottom came off. It just slides like a drawer. I didn't know boxes could do that until I saw her do it. Cole sat very still. The bottom slides out. Uh-huh. There's a little notch on the side. You push it, and it just comes loose. Ruby frowned slightly the way a child frowns when trying to be precise about something important. She did it really fast, like she'd done it before. Cole did not say anything else for a moment. He simply looked at Carol, who had gone pale beside her daughter, and then down at his own hands, turning the small, strange detail over in his mind. A hidden drawer in an antique chest box operated quickly enough to suggest practice rather than discovery. It was the kind of detail no one would think to invent, and the kind of detail that would matter enormously once Frank Doyle finally got his hands on the gift room footage. He did not know it yet, but Ruby had just handed him the single piece of information that would make sense of everything Frank found on that recording 12 hours later. Walter was sitting up in bed when Margaret walked in. 20 minutes later, an IV line taped along the back of his hand, his evening jacket long gone, his shirt collar open at the throat. The hospital lights were dimmed to something almost gentle. Beyond the window, the lights of the small Texas town blinked against the dark like scattered embers. You look terrible, Margaret said, sitting beside the bed. Good to know my charm survived the poisoning, Walter said. His voice was rough, but it was his voice, and Margaret allowed herself a small breath of relief at the sound of it. She did not smile back. Why did you open it, Walter? He looked away toward the window, toward the dark hills he could not actually see from a hospital room, but knew were out there anyway. The same hills he'd grown that company out of, with nothing but stubbornness and bad credit. Because I wanted to believe she was wrong, he said finally. Margaret did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, but it carried the particular weight of an older sister who has spent 75 years learning exactly when silence helps and when it doesn't. Wanting a child to be mistaken isn't the same thing as proving she is. I know that. Do you? Ooh. He closed his eyes. I took that box out of her arms, Margaret. A 9-year-old girl wrapped around it like it was the only thing keeping the roof up, and I pulled it away from her in front of 90 people because I couldn't stand the idea that Vivian Cross would do something like this to me. Margaret's face softened just slightly, the hard lines around her eyes easing. Yes, she said. You did. And now you do something different, she said. Starting tonight. The door opened again, and Cole stepped through, his evening jacket finally discarded somewhere along the way, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked relieved at the sight of his uncle upright, though he tried to hide it behind a steadier expression, the kind young men learn to wear when they're trying to prove they can handle bad news. Still with us? Cole asked. Unfortunately for my enemies, Walter said. The small exchange eased the room for half a breath. Then Cole's jaw tightened, and the weight of the night settled back over all three of them like a thick wool blanket. Frank called me on the way over, Cole said. He's already started pulling the security footage from the gift room. He wanted you to know, before you heard it from anyone else, the timestamp shows Vivian going in there alone 20 minutes before the toast. Walter's eyes opened fully. Alone. Alone, Cole confirmed. The hospital room phone rang twice before Margaret answered it. Her voice clipped and guarded. It was Vivian calling from her apartment, her voice trembling with what sounded on the surface like nothing but worry. Margaret, please, I just need to know he's all right. Nobody at the house will tell me anything. He's stable, Margaret said, watching her brother across the room. Thank God. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all? Margaret hesitated, then said, almost as an afterthought, Frank's pulling the security footage from the gift room tonight. Standard procedure given what happened. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not long, less than 2 seconds. But long enough that Margaret, who had spent 75 years learning to hear what people did not say, noticed it the way she noticed everything. Of course, Vivian said, finally, her voice a half step too bright. Whatever Frank needs. I just want this resolved for Walter's sake. Margaret said nothing further and ended the call a moment later, but she stood with the receiver in her hand for several seconds after turning that small, almost imperceptible pause over in her mind, the way a woman turns over a stone in a riverbed, certain there is something underneath it she has not yet seen. She did not mention the pause to Walter that night. She would understand its full weight only 12 hours later, sitting beside her brother as Frank laid 8 still photographs across a rolling tray table one after another, until the pause on the phone line made perfect terrible sense. A knock sounded at the door before anyone could say more. Carol stood outside it with Ruby beside her, the girl rubbing one eye with the back of her hand, clearly fighting sleep and losing. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hargrove," Carol said. "I know it's late." She wouldn't settle until she'd seen for herself that you were all right. "I told her it could wait until morning, but she's about as stubborn as you are, I'm afraid." "Come in," Margaret said. Carol stepped inside slowly. Ruby followed close behind her, rabbit tucked under one arm, her eyes finding Walter immediately, and staying there the way a compass needle finds north, regardless of how the rest of the room is arranged around it. Walter looked back at her for a long moment. The room seemed to understand, without anyone saying so, that something important was about to pass between the two of them, something that mattered more than the bandaged hand, or the security footage, or the documents sitting in the folder on the rolling tray. He spoke first. "Ruby." "Yes, sir." "I should have listened to you." Ruby did not look proud. She did not look pleased. She looked like a child who had been doubted by every adult on that terrace and had still kept her hands wrapped around the truth, even when it cost her something, even when the cost was being laughed at by 90 strangers in front of the only home she had ever known. "I tried to stop you," she said. "I know you took the box back." "Yes," Walter said quietly. "I did." Cole looked away, blinking fast, his jaw working. Carol pressed her lips together, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "That was my mistake," Walter said. "Not yours. The grown-ups on that terrace failed you tonight. I failed you tonight. A man my age ought to know better than to let a room full of strangers decide what's true, especially when the only honest voice in the entire place belonged to the smallest person standing in it." Ruby thought about that the way she thought about everything, carefully, fairly weighing it the way a much older person might. "Are you going to be okay?" "Dr. Bennett says I will." She nodded once, serious and small. "Good." There was a quality to the silence that followed the particular hush that settles over a room when something has shifted permanently, even if no one present could yet name exactly what it was. Margaret watched her brother and the small girl regard each other across the hospital bed and felt for the first time that night a flicker of something other than fear, something closer to the quiet, stubborn hope that the worst of a thing might also eventually produce something worth keeping. Down the hallway, behind the closed doors of a small consultation room he had commandeered as a temporary base of operations, Frank Doyle sat hunched over a laptop, his tie loosened, a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold by his elbow. Frank had been Walter Hargrove's chief of security for 19 years. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, a former Texas Ranger, who had traded a badge for a private payroll 2 decades ago, and he had personally vetted every member of Hargrove Industries' inner circle, hired since his arrival with one notable exception. Vivian Cross had already been standing at Walter's side for 16 years by the time Frank came aboard. Her position so thoroughly established her history with Walter, so deeply trusted, that no one, including Frank himself, had ever thought to apply the same scrutiny to her that he applied to everyone else. He had built his entire reputation on a single principle, repeated to every junior man who ever worked under him: trust nothing you have not personally verified. And yet for 19 years he had extended Vivian Cross a level of unquestioned access that he had never granted anyone else on the property. Not because she had earned some special exemption, but because everyone around her, Walter most of all, had simply assumed it. That assumption sat heavy in his chest now as he scrolled back through the footage for the 11th time. He had not slept that night, and he would not sleep for several more, because the footage on his screen had kept him awake in a way that coffee alone could not explain. The gift room camera was an older model installed years ago, more as an insurance formality than any genuine expectation that someone might use it, tucked into the corner above a bookshelf where it caught the room in slightly grainy black and white. Frank had walked past that camera 100 times without a second thought. Now he understood it had quietly recorded the single most important 18 minutes of his career. He watched it for the 11th time, frame by frame, the timestamp ticking quietly in the corner of the frame. 14 p.m. Vivian Cross entered the gift room alone, the green silk box held carefully in both hands, her posture relaxed, her smile gone, the moment she believed no one was watching. The face of a woman alone in a room she did not know was being recorded. 7:15 p.m. She set the box down on the side table. The base tilted. A thin seam along the bottom slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. No casual observer would ever notice the kind of detail a craftsman builds into an antique, only when someone specifically requests it. In her right hand, a small glass vial with a fine metal cap. In her left, a pair of jeweler's forceps gripping a slender silver pin. 7:16 p.m. The pin disappeared into the underside of the velvet lining, threaded with the slow, practiced precision of someone who had done this before or had at least rehearsed it many times in private. Frank watched her hands on the screen steady, unhurried the hands of a woman balancing a checkbook rather than preparing to end a man's life, and that steadiness disturbed him more than anything else in the footage. Panic he could have understood. This was something colder. 7:17 p.m. Vivian dipped the very tip of the pin into the vial. Once. No more. A measured exact amount, the gesture of someone who had clearly done the arithmetic in advance and trusted it completely. 7:18 p.m. The false bottom slid back into place. The chess pieces were repositioned, adjusted, brushed smooth with the flat of her palm. The lid went back on. The ribbon was retied, precise, elegant, exactly the way it had looked sitting on the table 3 hours later, as though nothing at all had happened inside that quiet room. Frank paused the footage there and rubbed both hands down his face. Then he pressed play again and watched the seventh frame, the one that had kept him from sleeping at all. A small shape half hidden behind the tall potted palm near the door. A child's face turned toward Vivian, watching everything. A stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. Frank stared at it for a long moment. She was right there the whole time, he said quietly to no one. Exactly where she said she was. He kept watching. 7:19 p.m. A man appeared at the service entrance of the gift room wearing a black catering jacket that did not quite fit him through the shoulders. He was older than the rest of the waitstaff, his beard trimmed close along the jaw, his eyes moving with the particular alertness of a man who has spent a career watching exits rather than enjoying parties. Vivian crossed to him quickly and pressed a small envelope into his hand. He nodded once, said nothing, and disappeared back out the service door before anyone else entered the room. Frank had already run the staffing manifest twice. The catering company had no record of any employee matching that man's description. The name on the shift sign-in sheet, Daniel Renner, did not match payroll records for anyone in the company's history. The signature itself, when Frank compared it against the rest of the sheet, was forged in a hand, too careful, too deliberate. The kind of forgery a person practices in private until it looks effortless. He pulled the catering company's official roster up beside the footage and compared faces one by one against the 18 names listed for that night's event. None of them matched. Whoever this man was, he had walked onto Walter Hargrove's property wearing a uniform that belonged to someone else, moved through a controlled service entrance without raising a single question from the regular staff, and walked back out 20 seconds later. His task complete, his face never once turning fully toward any camera in the house. That alone told Frank everything he needed to know about how many times this man had likely done something similar before. He was already running the man's face through every database his old Ranger connections could still access, calling in favors he had not used in years. The kind of favors a man saves for exactly one situation in his entire career. By morning, he would have a name: Dale Renner. A contractor in the loosest and darkest sense of that word, with a long, quiet history of work for people who paid in cash and asked no questions in either direction. But that discovery was still hours away. For now, Frank simply watched the footage one more time and felt the particular cold settle into his chest that comes from realizing a threat had been standing in your employer's house, wearing a borrowed jacket, and no one had stopped him. Morning arrived gray and overcast, an unusual color for a Texas sky in that season, as though the weather itself had absorbed something of the previous night. Frank Doyle arrived at the hospital a little after 7, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, the look of a man who had not slept because the truth had kept him company all night instead. He was tall, gray-haired, built like a retired linebacker who had decided somewhere along the way that suits suited him better than a uniform. Walter saw the look on his face the moment he stepped through the door and understood immediately that part of Frank's sleepless night had been spent reviewing his own decisions. The hiring records, the background checks, The years of trust extended to a woman Frank himself had once cleared for every level of access in the company. "Show me," Walter said before Frank had even closed the door behind him. Frank set the portfolio on the rolling tray table and opened it. Several printed stills lay inside, arranged in sequence, numbered along the bottom edge in neat black marker. "You need to understand something before you look at these," Frank said quietly. "The footage is clear. There's no ambiguity in it. It is not flattering to Ms. Cross." Walter held out his hand. "Frank, she planted a poison pin in my birthday gift on the night I was going to hand her 35 years of partnership, the keys to the next chapter of this company. I am well past needing things to be flattering." Frank slid the first photograph across the table. Walter studied it in silence. Then the second. Then the third. His jaw tightened with each image, the muscle along his beard working hard enough that Margaret, standing at his shoulder, reached out and rested a hand briefly against his arm, not to comfort him, but to steady herself as much as him. By the fourth photograph, Walter's hand had curled into a fist against the bedsheet, the IV line pulling taut against the tape on the back of it. He had spent 40 years reading men across negotiating tables, learning to see the small tells that separated a hard bargainer from an outright liar, and he recognized with a kind of sick clarity that he had been looking at one of the most practiced liars of his life for over 3 decades without ever once suspecting it. The sixth photograph stopped him entirely. The small shape behind the potted palm, the child's face, the rabbit. "She was right there," Walter said very quietly. "The whole time." "Yes," Frank said, "exactly where she said she was." The seventh photograph showed the man in the catering jacket, the envelope changing hands. Margaret leaned in carefully without touching the print. "Who is he?" "We're working on that," Frank said. "He was on the catering sign-in sheet under the name Daniel Renner. The staffing agency confirms nobody by that name was ever assigned to the event. The signature is forged. I've got people running his face through every system I've still got access to." Walter stared at the photograph for a long moment, the man's calm, watchful eyes seeming to look back at him from the still image. "He used the service entrance," Walter said. "He knew exactly where the cameras weren't pointed. Either Vivian let him in or he already had access to this property before last night," Frank said. "Given the layout, he knew the angles he avoided and the timing of the staff rotations. I don't believe this was his first time inside your home." Cole exhaled slowly from his chair near the window. "Uncle Walter, this isn't just Vivian." "No," Frank said. "This is organized. This took planning, and planning takes more than one person." Hugh Bennett stepped into the room, then holding a tablet, having clearly been told by someone outside the door to listen first and speak only when there was something worth saying. "Lab called back with the full panel," he said. "The substance on the pin is confirmed synthetic, not commercial, not pharmaceutical. The chemist who reviewed it said the design priority was small dose effectiveness through a minor skin breach built specifically to mimic a cardiac event if a physician wasn't already on scene." The room went very still. Margaret walked to the window, not because she wanted the view, but because her anger needed somewhere to go that wasn't her brother's hospital bed. Walter closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Frank," he said, "the study, back at the house. What about it?" "Vivian was in there last week. She told my housekeeper she was looking for an old photograph from the company's 20th anniversary. "There are no photographs in the study," Walter said. "Those are all in the library, every one of them. I built that room myself board by board after we broke ground on the third drilling site. There has never been a single frame photograph in it. There's a desk, a safe, and a signature pad I had installed 2 years ago because Vivian convinced me electronic authorization would save us both time on routine filings." Margaret turned slowly from the window. What did she really want? Frank had already flipped his portfolio to a second section. "I had my assistant pull the access logs on the digital signature pad in your study overnight," he said. "In the past 6 weeks, it's been used outside your normal working hours 14 times. Most of those nights, you were either at a board dinner, on a flight, or asleep in the east wing of the house." Walter stared at him. "What was signed? That's what I need you to look at." He turned the page. A printed list of internal documents, timestamps beside each one. Some were routine standard operating filings any company generates by the dozens. Equipment leases, supplier renewals, minor amendments to insurance policies that any chairman would expect to authorize without much thought. Several were not. Walter's eyes moved down the list and slowly settled on 3 lines near the bottom. Amendment to the Hargrove Industries Voting Trust. Temporary chairman authorization. Conditional asset transfer provision contingent upon medical incapacitation of the chairman. Vivian Cross's name appeared as the designated contingency officer on all 3. She rewrote the chain of command, Walter said quietly. Margaret crossed the room. What does that mean in plain terms? It means, Walter said, his voice flat, now stripped of the warmth it usually carried even in difficult moments, that if I had been declared medically incapacitated even for a short period, even for a matter of days, Vivian would have stepped into temporary control of the voting trust, the chairmanship, and every account tied to company assets. Long enough to move shares, long enough to authorize a sale that I have refused personally more times than I can count. He looked down at the printed list again, at the careful bureaucratic language designed to look unremarkable to anyone who skimmed it quickly. A phrase here, a clause there. Nothing that would raise alarm unless a person knew exactly what they were searching for. He thought of how many nights he had slept soundly in the east wing of his own house, while someone walked past his bedroom door and into his study to dismantle one clause at a time, everything he had spent his life building. To whom? Cole asked, though something in his face suggested he already suspected the answer. Walter didn't have to think long. The same buyer she's been pushing me toward for 2 years, he said. The conglomerate out of Houston. The one I've turned down at every board meeting since they first made an offer. The one whose representatives she keeps inviting to dinners. She organizes dinners I always assumed were just her being thorough. Frank nodded slowly. We pulled flight records first thing this morning. 3 representatives from that conglomerate flew into the regional airport this week. None of them are still here. They left yesterday afternoon. Cole's voice came out low. Before the party. Before the party, Frank confirmed. Walter leaned back against the pillows. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The bandaged thumb on his hand throbbed with a quiet, insistent rhythm that felt to him in that moment like a clock counting down towards something he still could not fully name. They were waiting for the news, he said finally. They were going to fly back the moment word got out that I was gone. Margaret's voice went hard as flint. And Vivian would have signed the deal as acting chairman while you were still in the ground. Yes. Cole ran a hand down his face. 35 years. She stood next to you for 35 years. She stood next to my money, Walter said. She stood next to my access. The friendship was the path. It was never the destination. He said the words quietly, almost to himself, testing the shape of them, the way a man tests a wound to see how deep it actually runs. A nurse knocked, briefly checked the IV line, and left without comment. Hospitals, Walter thought, had a particular way of carrying on, through earthquakes, the small routines of the building moving forward, regardless of what kind of devastation had just been laid out across a rolling tray table, 6 inches from a patient's lunch tray. Frank, Walter said. Where is she now? Her place in town. She got home around 4 this morning. She hasn't left, but she's made 3 calls already. 1 to her attorney, 1 to a private banker in Geneva, 1 to a private banker in Geneva, 1 to a number we're still tracing. She's preparing to move, Walter said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Walter looked at his sister. Elle, I need to go home. You are not leaving this hospital, Margaret said immediately. I'm not leaving the bed permanently. I'm leaving the hospital. I want to be in my own study when she's brought in. I want her to see the room she stole my signature in. I want this to end where it started. Margaret studied him for a long moment, the way she had studied him countless times over 71 years of being his older sister, weighing the stubbornness against the wisdom, trying to decide, as she always had, which one was winning. Finally, she nodded once. Hugh. Hugh sighed, already reaching for his tablet. I knew this was coming the second Frank walked through that door. 6 hours. Then I want him back here for observation, and I want a security detail on this room the entire time he's gone. 6 hours, Walter agreed. By the time Frank left the room to begin arranging transport, the gray morning light outside the window had begun to lift the clouds, breaking apart just enough to let a thin line of sun fall across the foot of the bed. Walter looked down at his bandaged hand, the small wound that had nearly cost him everything, and thought of Ruby's voice cutting through the chandelier light the night before, steady and small and absolutely certain. He had not believed her then. He intended to spend the rest of whatever years he had left, making sure he never made that mistake again with anyone, regardless of how small or unimportant the world told him their voice was supposed to be. There was a particular kind of humility that came with surviving something you should not have survived. And Walter Hargrove, lying in a hospital bed at 71 years old, with his thumb wrapped in white gauze, felt it settle over him now like a second skin. He had spent 4 decades being the man other men listened to, the man whose word ended arguments in boardrooms, the man whose handshake was worth more than most contracts. He had built that reputation on instinct, on the particular confidence of a man who trusted his own judgment above all else, because his judgment had built an empire from nothing. And his judgment had nearly gotten him killed because he had trusted the wrong person for 35 years and dismissed the right one in under a minute. Down the hallway in the family lounge, Carol sat with Ruby's head finally resting in her lap. The girl asleep at last, the rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Carol stroked her daughter's hair, slowly staring at the gray light gathering outside the window, and thought about all the small, quiet years she had spent in that house, refilling glasses, disappearing into doorways, being thanked for nothing. She thought about the way Margaret Hargrove had crouched in front of her chair the night before and said simply, "It will not happen again." She did not yet know whether to believe it. She had heard similar words before from other employers in other houses, words that meant something for exactly as long as the crisis lasted and dissolved the moment life returned to its ordinary shape. Wealthy families apologized beautifully. It was forgetting that they tended to struggle with. But for the first time in 11 years, she allowed herself to hope that it might be true. Something about the particular stillness in Walter Hargrove's face when he had looked at her daughter and said, "I should have listened to you," carried a weight that the easy apologies of other men in other houses had never quite managed to carry. Outside, the sun continued to rise over the hill country, indifferent and steady, the way it had risen over that same stretch of Texas land for longer than any fortune built upon it, longer than any friendship broken upon it, long enough to have seen 1,000 men like Walter Hargrove rise from nothing and learn sooner or later exactly who had been standing beside them the whole time and why. Somewhere across town, in an apartment with the blinds still drawn against the gray morning light, Vivian Cross sat at her kitchen table with a phone in one hand and an untouched cup of coffee in front of her. Watching the minutes pass, waiting to learn whether the night had gone the way she needed it to go, unaware that 11 floors below her in a parked sedan with 2 men inside it, Frank Doyle's people had already begun watching the building, and that the careful, patient unraveling of 35 years of deception had only just begun. By late morning, Walter was home. Not the home of the night before. That home had been a backdrop for a betrayal, every lantern, every chair, every inch of white linen tablecloth now soaked through with the memory of what had happened beneath it. This was something else, the same ranch, the same hill country light, but carrying a different weight. Now the weight of a man returning to a place he had to learn to trust again from the ground up. The truck rolled up the long gravel drive a little past 11, dust rising gold behind it in the morning sun. Frank had insisted on 2 security vehicles trailing close behind, and Walter had not argued, which told Margaret, riding beside him in the back seat, more about the seriousness of the morning than any document in Frank's portfolio had managed to convey. She had spent 75 years watching her brother refuse help of almost every kind, the particular stubbornness of a man who had clawed his way up from nothing and never quite trusted that anyone else's protection could match his own instincts. The fact that he sat quietly now, allowing 2 armed vehicles to flank him on a road he had driven 1,000 times without a second thought, told her exactly how deeply the previous night had shaken him. The household staff stood quietly along the entry path as Walter was helped out of the truck. Careful, watchful, the hushed quiet of people who had spent the night hearing fragments of a story too large to fully believe. One by one as he passed, they nodded to him, not with pity, but with something closer to fierce protective respect. Word had already moved through the staff quarters before sunrise, the way it always does in a house full of people who notice everything and say almost nothing. And by the time Walter came home, every man and woman who worked under that roof understood that a 9-year-old girl had done what none of the rest of them had managed to do. Walter paused near the front steps, leaning on his cane, and looked back at the terrace where the party had taken place less than 18 hours before. The catering crew had already cleared most of it away that morning. Under Frank's supervision, the tables folded, the chairs stacked, the lanterns taken down one by one and boxed for storage. Only the long oak table remained bare now, scrubbed clean, sitting in the morning light, like the last witness to something the rest of the property was already trying to forget had happened at all. He did not linger there long. There would be time later to stand at the head of that table and decide what to make of it. For now, there was a child waiting for him near the staff wing, and a study upstairs that held 14 weeks of forged signatures he intended to see for himself. Carol stood near the side path leading toward the staff wing, Ruby close beside her. Walter saw them and asked the driver to stop the truck. "Ruby," he said, leaning against the open door for support, "I want you and your mother in the study with me when this is finished, if your mother is willing." Carol looked startled. "Sir, she's a child. She doesn't need to be part of—" "I know," Walter said. "I want her to see that adults can do the right thing once a child has told them the truth. I want her to know it isn't always the way it was last night." Carol's eyes filled, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Frank's team had located the man from the gift room. The private airstrip sat 18 miles outside the county line, a single paved runway, and a low metal hangar surrounded by scrub brush and mesquite, the kind of facility small enough to escape most people's notice, and exactly the kind of place a careful man might choose when he needed to leave a state quickly and quietly. The man waiting beside the chartered plane that afternoon wore a different face than the one the gift room camera had captured, a pair of reading glasses. He did not need a baseball cap pulled low, the unremarkable posture of a businessman in a hurry to make a connecting flight. He had done this before. He had built an entire career on disappearing cleanly, on never once looking like the kind of man worth a second glance. He did not see the two unmarked sedans approaching from the access road until it was already too late to matter. Federal agents alerted by Frank Doyle's flight record search hours earlier took him without incident at the base of the boarding stairs, his hand still resting on the strap of a leather travel case. He had not yet managed to load onto the plane. Daniel Renner was not his real name. His true name was Dale Renner, and he carried a long, quiet history of contract work for people who paid in cash and bought silence with it. Inside his bag, agents found 2 passports, just over $14,000 in mixed currency, and a small leather case containing 3 more glass vials of the same synthetic toxin Hugh Bennett had described the night before. 3 more, Walter said, staring at the photograph Frank had brought of the open case. He said the words slowly, letting their full weight settle into the room. "She had a list." Frank nodded. "We assume so. Renner hasn't said a word yet, but the list exists somewhere either on paper or in his head, and he's currently sitting in a room with people whose entire job is finding lists in heads, lawfully, patiently. And Vivian—" Frank's expression did not change, but something in his voice settled into a colder register. "Her car is at her building. She hasn't left since this morning." Walter's car pulled into the long drive of Vivian Cross's downtown condominium building 40 minutes later. 2 unmarked vehicles followed at a respectful distance behind. Frank rode beside him in the front seat. Margaret had refused to stay behind, sitting rigid and silent in the back. Hugh came too, not because there was any medical reason for it, but because he had stopped pretending years ago that he had any real control over what Walter Hargrove decided to do, and he wanted to be there in case the day held any further surprises. The drive into town took nearly 30 minutes, the hill country slowly giving way to the glass towers of the financial district where Hargrove Industries kept its corporate offices, the same towers Vivian had walked into and out of for 35 years, as though she owned a piece of every one of them. Walter watched the city pass outside the window in silence, his cane resting across his knees, and thought of the countless mornings he and Vivian had driven this exact route together, planning quarterly earnings calls, rehearsing investor presentations, building brick by careful brick, the very trust she had spent the last several months quietly dismantling from the inside. Vivian was already waiting in the lobby when they arrived. She stood near the elevators in a soft cream-colored coat, a small overnight bag resting at her feet, the same pearl earrings from the party still fixed in her ears. She had not slept either. Her makeup was flawless, applied with the same careful precision she brought to everything in her life, but her eyes betrayed her in a way 35 years of practiced composure could not quite cover. She saw Walter through the glass doors and her shoulders dropped half an inch. Not in defeat, in recalculation. The look of a woman quickly running new numbers on a deal that had just gone badly wrong. He stepped through the doors with the help of a cane, his bandaged hand tucked into his coat pocket. "Walter," she said softly, "you shouldn't be on your feet." "I won't be on them long. I came to say one thing." Vivian's mouth lifted into the same small practiced smile she had worn at every charity gala for 35 years, the smile that had closed 100 difficult negotiations before this one. "Then say it." "I trusted you," Walter said. "I'm not here to ask you why. I don't care why anymore. People like you always have a reason, and the reason is always smaller than the people you stepped on to get there. I'm here to tell you the chess set is in evidence. The pin is in evidence. The cameras are in evidence. The signature pad is in evidence. The voting trust amendment is being voided this afternoon. Dale Renner was picked up at noon. He had 3 more vials in his bag." She did not blink. He admired that in her in a way he was not proud of admiring anything about her anymore. "And the little girl?" Vivian asked. "She's at my home, in my study, where she will sit beside me when this is done." Vivian's smile finally faltered just slightly, the first genuine crack he had seen in it since the night before. "Walter, please. I have known you since you were a kid sleeping on a dorm couch trying to figure out how to finance one broken rig with a bank that wouldn't even—" "You have known my schedule for 35 years, Walter said. "You have known my access. You have known my weaknesses. You have not known me. If you had known me, you would have understood that the one thing I would never forgive is a child being humiliated in my own house for telling the truth." 2 officers stepped through the glass doors behind him. Polite, quiet, unhurried, the way professionals move when an arrest has been carefully arranged in advance. Vivian did not resist. She had spent her career preparing for many kinds of endings, but a small girl behind a potted palm had not been in any of them. And Walter watched in that lobby the precise moment she understood that her plan had failed, not because of a security flaw or a careless mistake in the lab, but because she had taken a glass vial out of her purse in a room where a child happened to be looking at the flowers. As the officers led her past him, she paused once. "She's a remarkable child," Vivian said. "Yes," Walter said, "she is." Then Vivian was gone, and Walter stood alone in the lobby of a building he had visited 100 times over 35 years, and understood with quiet finality that he would never enter it again. The interrogation room where Dale Renner sat that evening had no windows, only fluorescent light, and a steel table bolted to the floor, the kind of room built specifically to strip away the comfort of pretending you have any control over your situation. Renner said nothing for the first 2 hours. He had built his entire career on saying nothing, on disappearing the moment a job concluded, on never once leaving a thread that could be pulled. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable, a man who had clearly spent years training himself out of every visible reaction a frightened person might give away. The 2 agents across from him took turns asking questions in different ways, circling the same facts from different angles. The patient, unhurried interrogation style of professionals who understood that men like Renner did not break from pressure. They broke, if they broke at all, from the slow accumulation of evidence that made silence pointless. But the leather case with 3 remaining vials had already been processed, and the chartered flight he'd been attempting to board had a destination that interested the federal agents far more than Renner himself did. It was the destination, not Renner, that finally cracked the case open. The flight plan listed a private airstrip outside Houston, registered to a holding company, that after several hours of careful tracing led investigators back to the exact conglomerate Vivian had spent 2 years quietly courting on Walter's behalf, the same buyer he had refused at every board meeting for 2 straight years. When agents finally laid that connection out plainly in front of Renner, something in his composure shifted. Not because he feared prison. Men like Renner expected prison the way other men expect rain. He shifted because the silence he had been paid to keep had only ever covered Vivian Cross, and the people now asking him questions had just made it clear they already knew about someone above her, which meant his silence had stopped protecting anyone, including himself. "She wasn't running this alone," Renner finally said late that evening, his voice flat and unbothered, the tone of a man laying out facts rather than confessing to a crime. "She had a handler, someone from the buyer's side. They reached out to her 8 months ago after the 3rd time Hargrove turned down their offer at a board vote. They told her there was a faster way to get the deal done, one that didn't require his signature at all, only his absence." The investigator across the table kept his voice level. "Name." Renner gave it without hesitation, the casual indifference of a man who had already calculated that his own outcome would not change one way or the other. A senior representative from the Houston conglomerate, a man named Preston Holt, had flown in personally 3 times over the preceding year, always under the cover of routine acquisition talks, always meeting privately with Vivian in locations far from Hargrove Industries' offices. It was Holt who had supplied the introduction to Renner. It was Holt's people who had sourced the synthetic compound through channels that stretched well beyond anything a private security chief like Frank Doyle could trace alone, channels that would eventually require federal involvement to fully unravel. Frank received the call from his contact inside the investigation just after midnight, standing once again in Walter's study, the same room where the forged signatures had been authorized 14 times across 6 quiet weeks. "It's bigger than her," Frank said when Walter picked up the line from his bedroom upstairs. "She wasn't the architect. She was the access point. Someone on the buyer's side built this whole operation around the idea that the easiest way to acquire Hargrove Industries was never going to be through a fair offer. It was going to be through your obituary." Walter sat in silence for a long moment, the phone pressed to his ear, the dim lamp on his nightstand casting long shadows across the room. "How far up does it go?" "We don't know yet. The federal agents are treating it as a securities matter, now attempted murder tied to a hostile acquisition scheme. That's well above my level of authority to chase Walter. But it means this isn't over when Vivian's case closes. It means there's a company in Houston that needs to answer for what its people built." "Then let them answer," Walter said quietly. "I built this company with 2 hands and a loan nobody wanted to give me. I am not interested in spending whatever years I have left being intimidated by men who think a board seat is worth more than a human life." He hung up the phone and sat alone in the dark for a long while, listening to the wind move through the hill country outside his window, thinking of all the careful, polished dinners Vivian had arranged over the past 2 years, the representatives she had introduced, the patient case she had built for a sale he had refused without ever once suspecting the refusal itself might be the thing putting him in danger. He thought of how close patience had come to becoming murder simply because he had said no one too many times to the wrong people. The board hearing took place 11 days later in the same conference room where Walter had announced 4 decades earlier the acquisition of his second rig. The room was full that morning, every seat occupied, lawyers from 3 different firms seated along the back wall, a federal investigator present as an observer rather than a participant, there to confirm that the company's internal findings matched what the broader investigation had already uncovered. Cole sat at Walter's right hand, no longer simply the nephew waiting for a chairmanship, but the man who had spent the past 11 days helping Frank, an outside counsel, untangle 14 weeks of forged authorizations, 1 document at a time. Walter had spent much of the previous week preparing for this single morning, not the way he once would have, with talking points and rehearsed deflections, but with the plain, unembellished truth he had promised himself in a hospital bed. 11 nights earlier, he would never again withhold from the people who deserved to hear it. He had drafted the opening of his remarks 3 separate times, discarding each version for sounding too much like a man defending himself rather than a man simply telling his board what had happened. Walter stood at the head of the table, his cane resting against his chair, his bandaged hand finally healed enough to need only a small strip of gauze across the thumb. "Some of you have heard fragments of what happened at my home 11 nights ago." Walter began, his voice steady despite the quiet murmur that moved through the room. "I'm going to tell you the whole of it because every person at this table deserves the truth. The same truth a 9-year-old girl tried to give an entire room of grown adults and was laughed at for offering." He laid it out plainly. The pin, the toxin, the footage, the forged trust documents, the Houston conglomerate's quiet, patient campaign to acquire a company through his death rather than his consent. He did not soften any part of it, and he did not perform grief for the room the way Vivian had once performed it for him. He simply told the truth the way he wished more than anything else in his life that he had done on the night it mattered most. Several board members exchanged glances as he spoke, the particular silent communication of people who had sat across tables from Vivian Cross for decades and were now rapidly recalculating every meeting, every negotiation, every quarterly recommendation she had ever made on the company's behalf. One older board member, a man who had served alongside Walter since the company's earliest public offering, removed his glasses halfway through and simply stared down at the table, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes until Walter finished speaking. When he finished, the room sat in a long, heavy silence. Then the company's senior outside counsel, an older woman who had represented Hargrove Industries for nearly 20 years, rose slowly to her feet. The board will need to formally vote on severing all discussions with the Houston conglomerate, she said, permanently. And I would recommend a full forensic audit of every transaction touched by Ms. Cross's office across her tenure going back at least a decade. Agreed, Walter said. Cole will oversee the audit personally. Cole's head came up. Me? You, Walter said. You've spent 11 days proving to me you can find a single forged signature buried inside 6 weeks of routine paperwork. I'd say that qualifies you. A small, exhausted ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room. The first real laughter the company had shared in nearly 2 weeks. The vote was unanimous. Every connection to the Houston buyer was severed by the end of the day, and a federal subpoena, already prepared in advance by the investigators monitoring the case, was delivered to the conglomerate's headquarters before the sun went down. 3 weeks after that, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the study at the Hargrove Ranch sat filled with soft autumn light. The digital signature pad was gone, removed entirely, replaced with nothing at all, because Walter had decided that some conveniences were not worth what they had cost him. The desk itself had been moved 6 inches to the left, which Margaret had quietly observed was as much an act of exorcism as a piece of furniture could reasonably provide. The bookshelves had been rearranged too, the old company photographs Walter kept in the library finally brought into the study itself, framed and hung along the wall, where Vivian had once claimed falsely to have been searching for one. A new chess set sat on a low table near the window. A simple wooden one, no false bottom, no velvet lining, no antique provenance worth mentioning. Just pieces and a board, and nothing hidden inside either of them. Ruby sat on one side of the board, her stuffed rabbit propped in the chair beside her. Walter sat across from her, his beard a little grayer than it had been a month earlier, though his eyes had regained something they had lost on the night of the party, a kind of settled clarity that had not been there before. He had taken over the past 3 weeks to spending most of his Saturday afternoons in this room, the door left open, the rest of the house moving comfortably around him in a way it had not in years. You move first, he said. White always moves first. That's the only rule in this room that isn't negotiable anymore. She slid a pawn forward. He slid one back. They played slowly the way Walter had come to prefer it, each move considered rather than rushed conversation drifting in and out around the game itself. In the unhurried way, conversations only happen between people who trust they will see each other again next Saturday and the Saturday after that. Do you still think about that night? Ruby asked him at one point, not looking up from the board, moving a night with careful concentration. Every day, Walter admitted. Not the way I used to in the hospital when it scared me half to death. Now it's more like a reminder. A good one. A reminder of what? That the truth doesn't care how old you are when you're the one carrying it. Ruby considered that for a long moment, the way she considered most things, and then simply nodded and captured his bishop, which struck Walter as a more honest response than anything he could have said in return. Carol sat near the window, watching them, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. She had not yet adjusted to her new title, which Walter had simply written into her contract as Director of Household Operations, with full authority over staff budget and scheduling, because Carol had told him very politely the morning after he came home that if she was going to manage his household, she was not going to manage it, the way the last arrangement had allowed certain people to operate behind her back for years without her knowledge. He had laughed for the first time in nearly 3 weeks when she said it. On the corner of the desk sat a small leather folder, the paperwork for an education trust established in Ruby's name, fully funded through graduate school, along with a separate provision for a modest home for Carol whenever she felt ready for one of her own. A monthly allowance accompanied it, calculated carefully to support, without overwhelming enough to change the shape of their future, without changing who they fundamentally were. It was, Walter had told his sister privately, the smallest amount of money he had ever spent in his life that had mattered the most. Margaret stepped into the doorway of the study just as Ruby captured Walter's night and watched her brother lose the piece with a small theatrical groan that made the girl across the board grin for the first time all afternoon. You're letting her win, Margaret said. I am not, Walter said. She's winning. Ruby did not look up from the board. I'm winning, she confirmed in the same flat, certain tone she had used on the terrace weeks earlier. The tone of a child who had learned the hard way that telling the truth plainly was always worth more than softening it for the comfort of the room. Outside the study window, the long pasture rolled down toward the small stock pond at the edge of the property, the late afternoon light gold across the grass, and somewhere far beyond it, in a federal courthouse downtown, the woman who had once been called Walter Hargrove's right hand was learning exactly what it cost a person to underestimate a 9-year-old girl standing behind a potted plant. A year passed. The ranch settled into a new rhythm during that time, one built less around board meetings and acquisition strategies and more around the quiet, steady work of running a company that finally trusted its own foundation again. Cole completed the forensic audit Walter had assigned him, uncovering in the process a string of smaller irregularities stretching back nearly a decade. Careful, modest sums diverted here and there, never large enough on their own to raise alarm. The kind of theft that depends entirely on no one ever looking closely. Every dollar was traced. Every account was corrected. And the following summer, nearly a year after the night of the party, Walter Hargrove finally stood in front of the company's full board and handed the chairmanship to his nephew. The ceremony, this time held without a single gift exchanged at Walter's specific request. "I don't need anything wrapped in silk to know what this company means to me," he told the room with the dry, exhausted humor that had slowly returned to him over the year. "I've had quite enough of silk for one lifetime." The federal case against the Houston conglomerate moved slower than anyone expected, the way these things often do when the people involved have enough money to hire lawyers whose entire job is to make slowness look like diligence. But by early summer, Preston Holt and 2 other senior executives had been formally indicted on conspiracy charges tied to the attempted acquisition scheme, and Vivian Cross, facing the considerable weight of footage-forged documents, and Dale Renner's cooperation with federal investigators, accepted a plea agreement that kept her out of a courtroom and put her behind bars for a span of years long enough that Walter no longer thought of her with anger so much as a distant, settled sadness, the particular grief reserved for a friendship that had been real once before it wasn't. A single letter arrived at the ranch that summer, postmarked from the federal facility where Vivian had been transferred to begin serving her sentence. Walter held it unopened for the better part of a week, setting it on the corner of his desk each morning and moving it unread to the same spot each evening, before he finally sat down with it one Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet and Margaret had taken Ruby into town for the afternoon. The letter was short, shorter than he expected from a woman who had spent 35 years choosing every word with the precision of a surgeon. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer any further explanation beyond what the investigation had already uncovered. She wrote only that she hoped someday he would understand that the friendship itself had never been entirely a performance, that some part of it had been real, even as the rest of it rotted quietly beneath the surface, the way a tree can stand tall and green for years, while the roots beneath it slowly give way. Walter read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beside the original handwritten card that had once sat tucked beside the ivory chess. King, the one he had never finished reading on the night of the party. He did not write back. Some doors, he had decided, were better left closed once they had nearly cost a man his life, even when a small, stubborn part of him understood exactly what she meant. Ruby turned 10 that summer in a celebration considerably smaller and considerably safer than the one that had marked Walter's 71st birthday a year before. She had begun attending a private school in town, the kind of school she would never have set foot inside a year earlier, riding there each morning in a car that Carol still occasionally found herself astonished to be driving. She kept the stuffed rabbit on her bed worn thin now at one ear, refusing every offer Walter made to replace it with something newer. Because, as she told him plainly one afternoon, some things were worth keeping exactly as they were, scuffed edges and all. She had also, somewhere along the way, developed a genuine talent for chess, the kind that made Walter suspect she had been quietly studying strategy books from his library between their Saturday games, though she always denied it with the same flat, unbothered certainty she brought to everything else. "You're getting better," he told her once after she had cornered his king in barely 15 moves. "I was always good," she said. "Nobody was paying attention before." He had no answer for that. He simply reset the board and asked her to play again. That same summer, at Cole's suggestion, and with Walter's full backing, Hargrove Industries quietly established a new internal policy, the kind that never made headlines but mattered enormously to the people who worked inside the company's walls. Every employee, from the executive floor down to the newest hire on a drilling crew, was given a direct anonymous channel to report any concern, any irregularity, any instinct that something was wrong, regardless of how junior the person raising it might be, regardless of how senior the person they were raising it about. The board, somewhat to Walter's private amusement, wanted to name the policy after him. He refused and insisted instead that it be called simply the open door, with a small brass plaque mounted outside the executive boardroom that read nothing else but a single plain sentence. The smallest voice in the room deserves to be heard first, not last. Margaret had asked him once, not long after the plaque went up, whether he worried it was too sentimental for a company that built oil rigs and highway overpasses. Maybe, Walter had said, but I'd rather be a sentimental old man with his company intact than a hard-nosed one who got himself killed because nobody dared interrupt a party. Margaret had not argued with that. Walter visited the ranch study most Saturday afternoons that year, and more often than not, Ruby was there waiting for him, the wooden chessboard already set, the pieces arranged with the careful precision of someone who had come to take the game and the company seriously. Margaret joined them sometimes, sitting quietly in the corner, with a book she rarely read more than a page of content, simply to watch her brother rebuild one Saturday at a time, the particular kind of trust that had nearly been taken from him entirely. He had lost count by then of how many games she had actually won. On the anniversary of the party, Walter walked out onto the back terrace alone just after sunset, the same string of lanterns hanging overhead, replaced now, restrung, lit again for an ordinary evening, rather than a celebration anyone needed to fear. He stood for a long while at the head of the long oak table, the same table where a green silk box had once sat at its center, and thought about the particular shape of the lesson the past year had carved into him. He had spent 40 years believing that strength meant never being wrong, that a man who built an empire from nothing earned somewhere along the way the right to trust his own judgment above every other voice in the room. It had taken a 9-year-old girl, a poison pin, and the longest night of his life to teach him otherwise. Real strength, he had come to understand, was not the absence of mistakes. It was the willingness to stop mid-mistake and listen, especially when the voice asking you to listen belonged to someone the rest of the room had already decided did not matter. He thought, too, of all the years before that night, the decades he had spent surrounded by men and women who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, because his approval meant contracts, promotions, access to a fortune most of them could only imagine. He had mistaken that chorus of agreement for trust for 35 years, never once noticing that the only voice in his life that had never asked him for anything, the only voice that had spoken up purely because it could not bear to watch him walk into danger, belonged to a child too young to understand boardrooms or trust funds or hostile acquisitions, a child who understood only the plain simple fact that someone she cared about was about to get hurt, and that mattered more to her than whether anyone believed she had the right to say so. He thought of Ruby's voice cutting through the chandelier light that night, steady and small and entirely unafraid. "Don't open that box, sir." He had not listened then. He intended to spend whatever years remained to him making absolutely certain he never made that mistake again. Behind him, through the study window, he could see Carol moving through the house with the quiet authority of a woman who finally ran it on her own terms. And somewhere upstairs, he could hear Ruby's laughter drifting down the hallway, bright and unguarded. The laughter of a child who had once stood alone against an entire room of doubt and had been right. The wind moved gently across the hill country, carrying with it the quiet of a place finally at peace with itself, and Walter Hargrove stood beneath the lanterns, for a long while, an old man with a gray beard and a healed hand, grateful in the end for the one voice he had almost failed to hear in time. This story reminds us that the truth often arrives in the smallest voice in the room, and that ignoring it can cost far more than we ever expect it to. It teaches that wealth, status, and decades of friendship are never a substitute for character, and that real strength is not found in refusing to be wrong, but in the willingness to listen when someone stands before you and says simply, "Please stop." Ruby's courage proves that integrity has nothing to do with age. Walter's journey proves that the most powerful thing a man can do at any point in his life, no matter how much he has built or how many years he has behind him, is admit the moment he was wrong and spend whatever time remains making it right.